The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. After entering a boat, Jesus made the crossing and came into his own town. And there people brought to him a paralytic lying on a stretcher. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Courage, child, your sins are forgiven." At that, some of the scribes said to themselves, "This man is blaspheming." Jesus knew what they were thinking and said, "Why do you harbor evil thoughts? Which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven, or to say rise and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He then said to the paralytic, "Rise, pick up your stretcher, and go home." He rose and went home. When the crowd saw this, they were struck with awe and glorified God who had given such authority to men. The Gospel of the Lord. So we have that very famous passage from the book of Genesis, which some of you have heard me comment on before. I'm just going to go over three basic things that we need to know about the story of Abraham and Isaac. This is perhaps the central story of the entire Old Testament. There's three things that we need to know about the story. First of all, we need to know why God would ask for child sacrifice. For many of us, that seems like the strangest thing that God does in the Old Testament. Why would he ask Abraham to do this terrible thing? It's important to understand that in the context that Abraham was living in, and in the context of the days of Moses, who was writing this story, right? In those days, to offer a child to a pagan god was not that uncommon. In fact, many times in the Old Testament, when there are wicked kings on the throne who abandon the God of Israel, one of the things that tends to happen is they begin to institute child sacrifice to the Baals, right? And so if you were reading this story in the days of Moses, you would have realized that the God of Israel does not desire human sacrifice, right? All throughout the rest of the story, it seems like every other God, and then at the end, he steadies Abraham's hand, signifying that he does not desire the death of the living, does not desire human sacrifice. That's what they would have seen. Two other things we need to know about this story is the age of Isaac. And many times when we read this story, we think of Isaac as kind of a naive little child. We know that that's not the case. We know that for a few reasons. First of all, Isaac is the one who carries the wood for the offering, right? The heaviest part of the offering. If he was just a small child, he would not have been able to carry that wood up the mountain. We also know that he's older because if you pay attention to the genealogies in the book of Genesis, it says that Sarah, Abraham's wife, was 90 years old when she conceived Isaac. And in the very next chapter of Genesis, Genesis 23, we read about the death of Sarah. And it says that she was 137 when she died, so 47 years after conceiving Isaac. Presumably, since nothing else is mentioned in between that story and this story, presumably she died not long after this, right? Which would make Isaac an older son. Also, the word in Hebrew that is used for Isaac is the same word that is used to describe the servants of Abraham, which typically signifies someone who is older, right? So Isaac is not just a naive child going to the offering, but rather he is a son who trusts his father and trusts the promises that God has made to Abraham, that through this son he would receive his descendants. The book of Hebrews comments on this, saying that Abraham believed that God could even bring his son back from the dead, if that was God's promise, right? So Isaac, because he is older, we know that he is one of the greatest prefigurations of Christ in the entire Old Testament. All throughout the Old Testament, God in mysterious ways was preparing his people for what one day would happen in his son Jesus. And Isaac is perhaps the most striking. We know that Isaac was a young man, right, around the same age as Jesus when Jesus was sacrificed. And we know that just like Jesus, Isaac carried the wood for his own offering. We know that when Isaac was saved and was not sacrificed, There was a ram who took his place, a ram who was caught in the thicket of thorns, right? Jesus is the substitute for us, who, when he was sacrificed, was crowned with a crown of thorns, right? All these similarities between Isaac and Jesus. And even at the end of the story of Abraham, we see a foreshadowing of this. That Abraham, after Isaac was saved, he called that place a particular name. God will provide, or Yahweh Yireh. Later on in the Old Testament, this mountain is called Mount Moriah. We read in the book of Chronicles that it's on this very mountain range that the Jews ended up setting up the capital in Jerusalem, right? So Jesus, when he was sacrificed in the same region, perhaps the very same mountain, that Isaac himself let himself be bound on the altar. So important that we see all of these connections. It sheds lots of different lights on the story. And in fact, this story sets the stage for the rest of salvation history. All throughout the Psalms and later on the Old Testament prophets, even in the New Testament, oftentimes one of the things that people will say is, God, remember your promise you made to Abraham. What was that promise? It was that promise he made right here in chapter 22 of Genesis. Because of Abraham's fidelity, God by himself promised that he would bring about all of those promises to Abraham. No matter how unfaithful the people would be in the future, God himself would bring about his promise. And that promise was fulfilled in Jesus.